Hey everybody, it's the joy of wrestling. Paul Fontaine. I have not called it the Dynamite Show once. Um, and with me is my esteemed colleague Garrett Gonzales joining me for the first time on this show. I had him on my previous Cup of Joe with Grandpa Dez, and I've been really looking forward to getting him on this one because I love this concept, and every show's been different. And I think this one's getting to be even more different. So it's kind of cool because what you're doing is kind of the original idea I had for this show. And what other people have been doing have been taking me in directions that I wasn't really thinking about going, which is cool.
Can
So,
I give you some feedback
sure.
from somebody that I wouldn't even have thought knew that you were doing this? So I do observe this with my buddy Draven,
Yeah.
and he reached out to me and he's like, "Hey, get Fontaine to invite me on. I really love that concept."
Oh,
So,
wow.
someone who's not even really in our ecosystem, he saw it somewhere and he's like, I want to be on. So I told him that I would let you
Yeah.
know so that you
I
could
think
invite.
we follow each other, so I'm definitely going to have him on. You sent me his contact
Yeah,
info. I've got a list and he's on it. So I'm just kind of going in order. I got Sam Shipman coming up next week.
there
So
you
that's
go.
going to be fun, yeah. And and I got you here this week. So we've talked about a WrestleMania before, but we're going to go way back on this one. And I didn't even tell you this, but I got a cool story about WrestleMania 2. We'll get to that at some point. But you also sent me a link for Saturday night's main event, which looks like it was building up. That WrestleMania. So you've chosen WrestleMania 2, I assume,
So
or
it's kind of like the genesis of my wrestling fandom, like where it kind of goes into overdrive, because I knew that the original WrestleMania happened. I knew that that show was a pretty big deal, but I'm in the VHS tape rental. Back then, I wouldn't even known of how to watch it live. My parents were not gonna, take me to some closed circuit event. And I wasn't really watching regularly back then, but just the fact that Cyndi Lauper and Mr. T were involved, I was like, oh, this is kind of on my radar. But the thing that kind of kicks my fandom into gear is a Saturday night's main event that I sent you from, I think it's February of '86. So
yeah.
I'm like 9 years old. I wouldn't
Okay, I
be
was gonna
10.
ask how old you were. So 9. Okay.
I wouldn't be 10 for another 3 months.
Okay.
And so I'm trying to remember kind of why I would have even watched this show. But Saturday Night Main Event on the West Coast is actually, I guess it is on the East Coast as well. It's at 11:30, so you got to stay up. It's during Saturday Night Live. My dad thought that Saturday Night Live was a little too risque for me back then, so I wasn't really able to watch that show. But Saturday Night's Main Event, like, he just thought, his idea of wrestling was Pepper Gomez and Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson. And so he's like, oh, yeah, it's harmless. He thought it was really stupid, but he thought it was harmless. And the reason why he thought it was stupid is because of the dumb baby face of Pepper Gomez letting the heel, trusted in the
Yeah.
heel and got knee dropped off of the top ropes. He's like, "Oh, this is stupid. Why would anybody ever do this? Like, my hero is dumb. I'm not watching this anymore." So he was like, "Yeah, it's fine, but wrestling's really dumb, and you probably won't be watching it for long." So, anyways, watching this show, it's Hogan and Morocco, and from what I know, that feud was kind of at the end for Hogan. That was probably more of a 84-85 run with
Yeah, yeah.
Morocco.
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of like a clue there as far as, okay, this is not really a contender. There's some setup going on. The other thing that I really remember, Mr. Fuji, who was Morocco's manager, was sick, and they showed like a little video of him drinking like chicken broth or something and having a thermometer, I think, of having a temperature to say that he was sick. So he was not able to be ringside with Morocco. So who is ringside with Morocco? None other than Bobby the Brain Heenan. So that's another clue that something was about to happen. So Hogan's about to win this match. Heenan interferes. Hogan does the thing where he grabs Heenan by his shirt and he's holding him out, like choking him like that. And I always thought that I was like, man, Bobby Heenan had to do that often. It doesn't
Yeah.
surprise me that he had neck problems like in his life, because he was always just doing these, like, as a small man, he was having to be thrown around so much by the top baby faces. So all of a sudden, King Kong Bundy attacks Hogan from behind, and they do the thing where they do the avalanches, but the avalanche in a match, Bundy would throw the guy into the corner, and he would take the avalanche like chest to chest. Bundy puts Hogan in the corner, but he does it where Morocco is holding Hogan's hands, so Hogan's chest is actually to the turnbuckle. So Bundy is doing the avalanche to Hogan's back. And I just remember thinking as a 9-year-old kid, oh my gosh, like, this is
Yeah.
cheating. Like, this is not fair at all in any way. Like, how come nobody, saved Hogan? He's supposed to be like, he's the face of the company, and no one came out to save him. Where's Andre?
Where's Hillbilly Jim?
Yeah, that's kind of my thought. So,
Yeah.
anyways, I was really hooked from that moment to be a week to week wrestling fan. I had to watch
Wow.
Superstars to find out. Actually, I'm trying to think if Superstars was even there yet, but there was like there was some time into where I was watching weekly.
Yeah, I wasn't getting WWF yet at the time, so I'm not even sure. The only WWF I ever saw was Saturday Night's Main Event for probably till maybe 80, like after this, probably around WrestleMania 3. So, I used to watch SNL, and then, every once in a while wrestling would come on and I'd be like, "Oh, cool." Like,
Yeah.
so I'm a little older than you. So I was like 15 when this aired.
So
And
I was a TV Guide kid,
okay.
and
Okay.
so I
You
would
knew
get
what was on all the time.
well, I would get the TV Guide in the Sunday paper. I would immediately flip to Saturday,
Okay.
and almost always it was going to be Saturday Night Live. But every 2 months or so, I'd flip and
Yeah.
I'd go, "Oh, Saturday night's main event is actually going to be on, so I can't wait." And sometimes they would even have, because they taped those events, and so they would even have the little billboard of who's going to be who Hogan is going to be fighting in the magazine. So there's a nice little week build up for me to like get really excited about what's going to happen on Saturday night. And there were some occasions where I felt so sad because for whatever reason I couldn't stay awake and I fell asleep, and
Oh,
and
no.
like the VCR didn't work, and then you wake up in the morning and you put the tape in, and it just doesn't happen, and you're just so brokenhearted. Like, those were the days
And
back
and
then.
and you just missed it.
Yeah,
Like,
and you
that's
missed
it.
it. There's no way to
Like,
watch it.
no, and
There's
there's no
no
way
way
to
to watch it until, like, I guess there was tape trading back
yeah.
then, but who's really tape trading
Well,
Saturday Night
at
Main Event?
9,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and there's no way to find out what happened. Like, they might tell you on Superstars,
yeah.
but I remember, like, even when I would rent, VHSs, for some of these shows, because we didn't get pay-per-view till, like, 92 in Winnipeg. I don't know about all Canada, but Winnipeg, the first one we got was SummerSlam 92. That's not, like, the first one I bought. That's the first time we could ever get it. So
Mhm.
ever since then, I got every single one. But I would have to rent them at the video store, and you'd watch Superstars every week, or whatever you got in wherever you were, and you'd hear about the main event, and you might hear about some of the other ones, but half those matches on the pay-per-view, like, I'm watching the VHS, I have no idea who's winning, like, a
Yeah.
month later, because no internet, no, like. And yeah, I mean, people, like, we have friends that were tape trading, like John Muse and people like that. We have, been tape trading since like the early 80s, but
Yeah.
I tape traded ECW a little bit in the mid 90s, but that was about it. I actually, that's not even tape trading. I just bought them. I'm not giving
Yeah,
anybody
because
any of my
you
stuff.
could buy them by what they had, like, a number that you could call,
Yeah,
right, to
yeah.
order 'em?
And my buddy Doug would buy them, and then he'd give them to me when he was done with them. So I still have them. Every once in a while I put them in. But so this was like, this aired March 1st. And yeah, I remember that show. I just watched it not that long ago. And it built to WrestleMania 2, obviously, Hogan and
Mhm.
Bundy. And that was only April 7th. So that's like just over a month later. And I mean, you look at now and people complain about, oh yeah, like they only got 2 weeks of build for this pay-per-view or whatever. And like here, it's like, this is it. Like this was the setup, this was the build. I mean, I imagine they did some interviews, but there's nothing else because Saturday's main event was it. Hogan didn't wrestle on Superstars. Bundy probably did, but I mean, literally, you got 1 hour a week and it's a bunch of squash matches. And then, like April 7th was WrestleMania.
If I remember correctly, I think they said Hogan was in the hospital.
Yeah.
And you could send him cards to express your love and good wishes for him as he was laid out in the hospital. But then again, I kind of wonder what the house show schedule was like after they ran that angle, because if he was wrestling in the house shows, then this television thing was meaningless to the smart fans. But to me, I wouldn't have known. I wasn't getting Pro Wrestling Illustrated for another year and a half, probably. But so, to go back to kind of the topic of this show, when you asked me to come up with something, my first thought, something that would give me joy, as a wrestling fan, would be something like Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero in the middle of the ring, WrestleMania 20. But that is not a joyful memory anymore. It's just not because of Benoit.
Yeah, and I mean, if someone picked that, I mean, we could, we'd certainly talk about it, but I mean, but that is kind of what it's about. Like, it's the purity of this. I once met somebody in Vegas, and this was at the convention, and their first memory and their first, when they fell in love with wrestling, believe it or not, and I think you might have heard this, but was Miz and Cena. Whatever WrestleMania that was,
27.
Yeah, it was the first time she'd ever seen wrestling. Her boyfriend showed it to her, and she fell in love with it. And 5 years later, she was in the crowd at NXT shows, and she ended up, be working in wrestling for a little while. But Miz and Cena, so there's something for everybody.
Yeah, and that moment, as I'm sort of explaining the joy of wrestling, that is not a joyful moment for me as a kid. I was actually, I mean, I knew that wrestling was not real, but the drama of it and Vince screaming about it and Jesse cackling about it, I was oh wow, I can't wait to see what happens next. And WrestleMania 2 was not as successful as WrestleMania 1, obviously, but my buddies, they ordered it, and I want to say that pay-per-view was on a Monday night, I believe.
April 7th, 1986.
I think it was a Monday night, but I remember they ordered it. They knew how into it I was, so they recorded it on their VCR.
You are correct. It was a Monday.
Okay. And so then, imagine counting down the days until your dad would drive over there to pick up the tape so that you could watch it. That's real patience and anticipation. So that makes that moment even bigger for me, which is I had, it's not like I could just order the show and watch it. I had to wait for friends. I had to get on the phone with them. I had to say, don't tell me what happens. And so, yeah, I talked to Scott about this, because Scott Edwards, who hosts the 5-Star Joshi show, and he's been doing
he's going to be on this as well.
He's been doing some awesome stuff on the Marigold thing. His videos are doing really well, and his podcasts are doing really well. He's the youngest dude around. It's amazing how young he is. So anyways, it's just all of those things are why this memory is so vivid to me. And it is really what locks me in as a wrestling fan. Now, the joy of that moment is not, again, it's not this joyous moment, but it is joy for me, because I can kind of smile about it and I can go back to that time frame, because as you know, I just don't watch wrestling like that anymore.
Yeah.
And it's very much more sport and covering sport and looking at angles and looking at things to talk about and looking at business and trying to figure out what the business side of things is. So it's more of homework essentially, so that I can talk about it. The joy for me in watching wrestling today is literally to talk about the wrestling, not, and I still enjoy, I enjoy watching the shows if they're good. I don't know how much I enjoy watching the week to week TV these days. And some of it is just because there's too much of it. Like if there was one show or two shows, like let's say WWE had Raw and AEW had Dynamite, and we only had those two shows to watch, we would watch them probably live,
Yeah.
and we would be like, like every week
And if you
consistently.
had pay-per-views, like maybe every one between the two of them each month, so you had like 1 month it was WWE, next month was AEW, like that'd be almost perfect, you
Yeah,
know?
so,
Yeah,
to me, that moment in time of where I actually was, like, looking forward and I was
yeah.
locked in and I was like, "Wow, I can't get enough of this stuff." That was, that would have been the moment. And, the funny thing is, the other moment that is kind of similar to that, but it is actually a little sad for me as a kid, was Survivor Series, the very first Survivor Series. My dad's friend was recording it for me. She had the black box, and I was fired up for the very first Survivor Series, and we actually got Starrcade. We're like one of the four.
Oh,
We're one of the four markets in the entire U.S. to get Starrcade. So imagine turning that show on, expecting to see Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse, and seeing Jim Ross. I'm like, what is this? And then I
oh,
sort of,
so you weren't familiar with it at all?
I wasn't watching
Okay.
NWA week to week. I was familiar with a good number of the wrestlers, but I just did not expect that show was going to be the one that was on the videotape. I almost thought like, wow, that I gave her or she gave me the wrong tape. Like there's like
Would that have been Chi-Town Heat?
that would have been Chi-Town Heat,
Oh, wow, so
1987.
that's the first WCW pay or NWA pay-per-view
NWA
I saw
pay-per-view.
as well.
So,
Yeah,
and it's literally the very first NWA pay-per-view.
yeah, yeah.
And the great thing about that is it was the best experience because I was like, okay, I don't have any options here. So I'm going to sit through this. NWA fans at that time will say that card kind of ruined the town. Like those guys were never as over in Chicago anymore because of that show. The Road Warriors,
Yeah, they
they
lost,
they
yeah.
do the stupid dusty finish for Tully and Arn. So, but not to say that was the greatest show of all time, but for us, we had like very few stuff to choose from. You can go to the video store. There wasn't a lot of options back then. There wouldn't be a ton for another couple of years. Coliseum Home Video. There was some, I think Starrcade 86 was like a video release. There was like a Crockett Cup, but it was like not the full show. It was like super edited. So there were a few, but for me, I was like, okay, well, I have to deal with NWA Starrcade, and I probably watched that just about as much as any other wrestling show that I ever watched. So in
'Cause
the end,
you had it on the thing.
yeah,
I had
it was
WrestleMania f
great
I
for
had
me.
WrestleMania 4 on one of those, taped from a black box, so I watched that thing like 100 times, and my
Yeah.
kids watched it. My son, like, to him, wrestling is WrestleMania 4.
Mm-hmm.
He's 32 now. That's all he like, so his reference point is he compares everything to WrestleMania 4, and in
Yeah.
his mind, that's, like, an all-time great show, even though it's, like, probably one of the worst Manias ever. You
You
brought it
could probably edit a version of WrestleMania 4 to make it semi exciting, but the
Yeah.
whole 4 hours
Oh, it's a
it's a
lot.
chore to get through, I think.
You brought up the Benoit and Eddie thing, and you're in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
Were you at the Cow Palace when Eddie won the title, or
I was not,
but you watched
but
it,
I
obviously?
watched it. It was the first internet pay-per-view that I ever bought.
Oh, wow.
Just because I wanted to see how it worked. I think it was a little
How
cheaper too,
was it
and,
any good, or
it
like
worked fine. We didn't, I can't remember what the internet, at home was at that point. I'm sure I had a DSL connection. The only problem was you had to watch it on the physical computer, so I couldn't
oh,
project it to
wow.
my television. But I just wanted to try it out, and yeah, I did watch that on
That would have been a
internet
feel-good
pay-per-view.
moment, obviously, seeing Eddie win the title and, like, over Brock, like, and nobody I don't think many I mean, you might have been expecting. You're probably a smarter fan than I was at the time. Like, at that time, I was still like not a I wasn't believing it was real or anything like that, but I didn't even know the Observer existed. So I'm just watching the show as a fan, and I'm like, Eddie's got no chance. I'd love to see him win, but he's got no chance. So I was like super happy for him.
I would have to go back and read those Observers, but from what I remember, it was one of those Dave things where he's like,
Could go either
if
way.
this happens, this could be the plan. But Vince McMahon has to actually go through with the plan, and he's kind of antagonistic with these hardcore fans or these internet fans about what they want. So if he actually does go through with this, it's because he kind of catered. That's kind of what I remember. I sort of think it was like, yeah, Eddie should win, but it's sort of the Vince could always change his mind. But that would be fun to kind of read back the weeks leading up to that No Way Out event.
We did. Remember, we had a short-lived show that we were doing for a while ago, where we were going back and reliving classic matches and talking about it at the time, and that would have been a good one to do. Can't remember what that one was called, but
The something debate or the
the Great Debate or something.
whatever we were talking about.
So I was going to mention to you how I saw WrestleMania 2, because we didn't have pay-per-view at the time. There was closed circuit, and I worked at the Winnipeg Arena. I used to sell popcorn and drinks and stuff. So I was watching the show, and then when I think by the third leg of it, we didn't have to sell anymore, and I could just sit down and watch. So I got to watch the third one, the Hogan part, by myself. And at the time, I wasn't watching WWF television other than Saturday Night's Main Event.
Right.
So the last thing I would have saw was the Hogan Bundy angle, and then I get to see the match. And what else was on there? And it was Rick Steamboat and Hernandez, Adrian Adonis and Uncle Elmer, and the Funk Brothers and Junkyard Dog. All I cared about was Hulk Hogan and King Kong Bundy. And and at this point, like I wouldn't say I was cheering when King Kong Bundy slammed Hogan, but I will say by the time we got to WrestleMania 3 and Hogan got the cross ripped out from him and Andre, I think I was cheering for Andre by that point. And by the time he lost his title, like I was like throwing things in the air. I was so happy that he lost the title. Like that's the kind of fan I was, and I was into Savage, I was into Piper, it was the bad guys, Jake the Snake, so
Do you know my WrestleMania 4 story of going into school?
Oh, yeah, because you knew
I knew
who
the
was gonna
finish of the
win.
main
Yeah.
event. I knew the finish of the main event between
Yeah.
Hogan and Andre because one of the Bay Area sports
Or
writers was either an Observer subscriber or had talked to Dave, and he basically gave out the finish, I think, on that Friday.
in an article
And
or
on the newspaper.
okay, yeah.
If you read, I think that issue is actually one of the few issues pre-91 that is on the website. Is for whatever reason, there's the random February of 1988. I think he may actually write about it in there, but yeah, like I went to school telling everybody what was going to happen, and then I come back that Monday, and everyone was like, "How did you know? That's crazy!" And so
Just having that tape made me a big deal because nobody else, like very few people had satellite dishes. So I had a buddy that recorded it, and he had like 5 VCRs going or something. I don't know. He recorded like a bunch of versions for friends, and I was one of the ones that got it. And and we got the Royal Rumble when Ric Flair won, a couple of years later. And so he only got a few of the pay-per-views. I don't know why. Like sometimes it didn't work, I guess. I don't know. But again, I wasn't like as hardcore then as I would end up being not too long after, but so it wasn't like I probably didn't even watch all the shows back then. But
you could imagine how what basically what the wrestling fan that I became when 1988 is when I feel like I'm sort of inside because I'm reading
12 years old and you're like BMOC, right? Like, yeah, that's cool. So I always finish by asking if there's anything, and and you brought it up, and this might be harder for you, but you might be able to come up with something because the way you watch wrestling now. But is there anything recently that made you feel happy just as a fan? You know, and you know people, so there's probably some stuff maybe, you know?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, All Out 2021
Oh, yeah, yeah,
is my favorite live wrestling show probably of all time. And sitting in that crowd with your friends, Andrew Zarian is behind me, hanging out with pals, and we're watching this show that seems like uh, a change. Like there's a
yeah,
change in the wrestling business coming out of that show. We did a live stream like that Monday, I think, after on this website we talked about that show, and that was a time where I was like, huh, like there's something here, and we may be at the precipice of something really fantastic. Now, didn't happen that way. It didn't stay that way for multiple reasons. WWE catching fire and AEW, kind of disintegrating a little bit.
Well, but in a way, it kinda did because, like, it kicked WWE into gear, and now we have AEW, which is doing great stuff, and we got WWE, which is better, so in a way, that was what they needed, because a couple months later, WWE really, like, hit rock bottom,
Yep.
like, in terms of ratings, probably quality, everything, and that was that was AEW just, they had all the momentum in, like, by December, like, 2 months after All Out.
Yep.
So, yeah, I could see that, and you were there live, so,
I was there
you know.
live, and
Yeah,
there's moments where you're just thinking like, oh, this is something special. This is something I'm always going to remember. And there
yeah,
are other moments where you're like, okay, like why am I even here?
yeah,
Why am I at the Cow Palace watching a terrible Dynamite and Rampage? Like this doesn't feel like that moment, and it's hard to compare. Like I know you didn't watch the recent pay-per-view,
not
but
yet,
or
I
not
will.
yet. You will, but there was a conversation after that show about what is it one of the best shows that they've ever done or whatever. A lot of times that happens after
Yeah,
AEW shows because people are usually pretty happy at the pay-per-views. And somebody asked me, in and I was thinking about it. I was like, "Huh, I have to think about that." But then I immediately went back to All Out 2021 because of the thought that we may be seeing like an adjustment in these companies, and it was kind of cool to be there and to be talking about it, and to, John LaRocca and I, we always talk about how doing a podcast while Dynamite was happening was very important to us because we're like right at the beginning, right? You're kind
yeah,
of cataloging everything. You're discussing everything. You're making it important. You're giving it some value. This isn't just a random wrestling show. No, we're actually creating our podcast around Dynamite, and we really enjoyed being at the beginning of that because, what imagine, when does WWE really become WWE? Imagine, Dave's writing about it. There are other newsletter writers writing about it, but being at the forefront and being like, here's what's going on and this is why it's important. So we really enjoyed that. And yeah, I mean, we're for those of us who do stuff like this, having both companies is fantastic, though.
yeah.
I think there is a little bit of a hangover when it's heavy weeks, because imagine Friday 2 hours of SmackDown, Saturday 3 hours of Collision and Rampage, and then Sunday 5 hour pay-per-view. Like that is a lot. And if you're watching the NBA playoffs and you're watching baseball, like it's just you just can't
Well,
catch up to
this
everything.
is why I haven't watched it yet. Like, I've got the NHL playoffs. I'm a diehard Jays fan, so I've got to watch every inning of that, and all the wrestling. So, like, I'm trying to get through it, and I'm like, I literally put my phone down. I got all my notifications muted. I'm like, we're communicating by email. So for me, I will say, and this is going to sound bad because I said I haven't watched Dynasty yet. Well, Dynasty streaming and Raw is on TV. So I did watch Raw tonight because it's on TV.
Yeah.
And so it's from Raw and for me. and it was the very beginning of Raw. There's a conversation in the ring between Damian Priest and Jey Uso, and this is like the most real conversation I think I've seen on WWE television to kick off a show. It's just two dudes.
Can it be
talking.
real though when one of the guys says "yeet" every other word?
But he wasn't saying it in this conversation.
Oh, okay, I'll have to
Yeah,
watch
like
that. I haven't watched it yet.
and it was Damian Priest mostly talking. So he was relaying a story about them, going out for drinks after a show and talking about how they were going to be the future. And now here we are, and we're main eventing a pay-per-view. But they were not using WWE vernacular. They were just talking like two dudes. And so it made me happy because I'm getting to see that now. It sounds basic, but like for the last 35 years of watching WWE, WWF, I'm watching Vince McMahon's version of what he thinks pro wrestlers should talk like. And now I'm watching two guys out there talking like athletes, and rivals. And this is what I like. And we're seeing more of it. And we've seen it in the other company for 5 years. Now we're seeing it here. In some cases we're seeing them do the stuff that we used to do, which I don't want to see, but this made me happy. And so yeah, and I always try to find something because I'm thinking about this show and thinking, okay, what can I talk about when we do this show? And now we got this. So
I thought about one more thing that is kind
Okay.
of recent that for me is about wrestling, but it is also about the content and the ability to utilize a platform like the Wrestling Observer to do things that you try to do them correctly. And I'm mostly talking about interviewing Kenny Omega.
Oh yeah,
twice.
cool.
Being like one of the very first Tony Khan interviews, even though that specific interview sucked because he was unwilling to say anything and he was very uncomfortable because he hadn't done a lot of that stuff yet. So imagine doing an interview with somebody and they just won't look you in the eye because they're just like not trained. Like I'm sure he's done stuff before, but he's kind of the focus and he was very uncomfortable. So, but then, the other ones that we did, he was very well prepared and he was way more comfortable. So it was kind of cool to see that evolution for him. But Omega twice, Bryan Danielson, and being able to Bryan Danielson was like, I've been reading this book by the guy who's from the roots, and I'm like, oh, Questlove, Creative Quest, like this book. I have this book, and for us to be able to talk about that, like Dave has no freaking idea about any of that stuff. So to be able to add a little bit of like pop culture knowledge and just understanding the outside of the wrestling thing to bring that into the interview, Jericho, Cody, I don't think I've talked to the Bucks before. I don't think I've been. I think the one time that we were supposed to do it, it was during the day. I had to go to the office, so Brian did it. Okada, Tanahashi, bunch of other people, like that thing where you go, okay, now this is
you didn't even bring up Moxley.
Well, Moxley was a whole different thing because it was like, it was almost surreal in a sense. And he's almost at a different level of kind of what you just said of human. Like he's the most human out of all of those guys. I would say human from the perspective of like a dude's dude. Like he's the most dude's dude. Kenny is unique on one level. Bryan Danielson's unique on a different level. Jericho is charming and promoting. Cody is so businessy and businesslike, and he doesn't want to say anything wrong. Moxley's like a dude's dude. You just like want to watch fights with this guy and hang out. Like, that's how it is. So like all of those things, to be able to bring my presence and my preparation and my knowledge to support Dave and also record it for him so that he could do that stuff. That is a thing that also brings me a ton of joy. It is tangentially related to wrestling, but kind of more related to the journalism thing. But
I, as a listener as well, and a friend of yours, I mean, I appreciate what you do because you add something that Brian is completely different. And I'm sure if Brian did those interviews, they'd be fine and they'd be good and they'd be different. But you add something to it that Brian doesn't have. So like I appreciate what you do. And so I'm glad you said that. And for me, like, you know, that reminded me of just, you know, like getting to do stuff with, you know, like Dave and Brian
Yeah.
and, you know, just
You were
recently
you were just on Wrestling Observer
yeah.
Radio.
And but even having Dave on this show and even having conversations with him and stuff. And these are things that, you know, like as a wrestling fan, you know, like 30 years ago growing up, I mean, and there's other stuff I could talk about, you know, like, I mean, I freaking like I have conversations with Lance Storm. Like if you told me like,
Yeah.
you know, 25 years ago that you're going to be like, you know, exchanging messages with Lance Storm, it's like, okay, whatever. So,
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a piece of this, right? And
yeah,
it
exactly.
becomes a maybe the most passionate hobby that we've ever had.
Yeah.
I
And one
guess.
I, you know, I don't really want to give up. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I will get to Dynasty and I'll give my thoughts on Wednesday when we do the Dynamite show. That's my cheap plug to end the show. And
Wait,
I'll
is Jeff gonna do the show, or is he pawning off Kevin Ely because you guys were having that conversation?
oh, I don't know. I assume I don't know.
That might be a joke. He may have been doing
Oh,
a little bit of a joke.
Kevin will be hosting next week because I'm going
Okay,
to Dynamite on
got
May
it.
1st. So
Got
I
it.
gotta when I check my DMs, maybe I'll find out some stuff I don't know. But Garrett, tell everybody. I've got a lot of people watching and listening, so tell everybody about the stuff you do.
Just tune in to the Fight Game Media YouTube channel. That's it. This is I mean we how many live streams do we have a week
Oh,
now? Probably like 5 or
5,
6, right?
6. Yeah, you've got to observe this. Okay, like not a regular schedule, but you know, when it needs to be. And we do the what is it, broken news every once in a while.
Every
We
once in a
haven't done it in a
while.
while.
When
Yeah,
when's necessary to pull that one out.
and of course, Observer Radio must listen to every Friday on if you got a subscription to Wrestling Observer Video, you can watch it, or you can listen if you have a audio subscription. So
Yeah, man, this was fun.
yeah. All right. And next week I'll have Sam Shipman from the Power Bombshells on. So that'll be a lot of fun. I have no idea what she's
Her
going to talk
joy of
about.
wrestling is going to be so much different than mine, by the way.
I think so. I think so. And again, it'll give me some stuff to think about too, because I really, really am glad I gotten to know Sam, and it's given me a much different perspective on things that I
Yeah.
wouldn't have had otherwise. So
Yep.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to that show. And I was looking forward to this one. So for Garrett Gonzales, I've been Paul Fontaine, and you've been watching The Joy of Wrestling.